then you start seeing it everywhere, and you know that. Well, Christian nationalism, of course, has been around quite a while, but I noticed I get a email from Diana Butler Bass, who's a church historian, and so she's done a whole series of her podcast on Christian nationalism, and I can highly recommend it as well. And then I've talked to you about the Baptist Joint Committee. They do this report from the Capitol each month, and here is this whole issue, or most of the issues on Christian nationalism, but you'll see it everywhere. And the other thing is, this curriculum was written by the Baptist Joint Committee, but you're going to see on the webinar Bishop Curry, who is the bishop of the Episcopal Church that we did his book on Wednesday nights, and then the bishop of the Lutheran Church, and I can't remember the other two people, but so it is not a denominational curriculum. It is lots of denominations who have come together to talk about this important topic. And I think that it supersedes political parties. I think there can be Democrats that are Christian nationalists, and there can be Republicans, and there can be independents. But I think it really is a danger, and I hope that when we finish this, you don't have to agree with me, and there's going to be time to talk and ask questions, because it's really that kind of curriculum. And so you certainly have every right, as I tell you on Sunday morning too, to say, I don't know if I agree with that, and to tell us what you believe and why. So don't feel that it's an indoctrination. It is an exposure for you to hear some words of people that I consider to be experts in this field, and hear what they have to say about it and why it is a danger to our country. So I am so glad. Where's Tom? He's washing dishes, I bet. I think he told me it's how many weeks? 57? Is that what somebody hear him say that?
51.
51, since we last were in the fellowship hall for Wednesday night, March of 2020. I remember it well. I was sitting in the parking lot when it was like, everything's closing, and we're going to have to close too. That seems like it was about 100 years ago, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. But it's only 51 months. I was going to tell you there were prayer lists on the table, but we will forego that right now. But I do hope that you're taking home the order of worship, and you're looking at the prayer list on the back to see the people from our congregation. We have a lot of people having surgeries and that kind of thing. So I do hope you'll take that home and pay attention to it. Okay, so I'm going to get started. If we were around the tables, and I don't know, we'll try it here too, but I'm not sure how it's going to work, because what I had planned was that some of the questions you might just talk to your table about, discuss it with your table for a couple of minutes, and then there's some questions that we'll talk, everybody share together, but I don't know how that's going to work, since we're kind of in, big globs of people, and there are a few people over there, so we'll see. But I know that you're the kind of people that can go with the flow, and so we're going to do that. So Christian nationalism is a framework of thinking that threatens our faith and our pluralistic democracy. If you remember what you were taught, when I was in elementary school, I remember being taught that the Pilgrims came because they wanted freedom of religion, because in England they couldn't practice their faith. You remember that?
Yeah.
And we never heard the rest of the story. And the rest of the story was, when they got here, they didn't want to let anybody else. They wanted just to practice their faith in their area and not let anybody else practice their faith. So our whole country has been based on this pluralistic idea that everybody has a right to worship as they please, to be the kind of, if they don't want to be a believer, they don't have to be a believer, right? They have the right to be an atheist or an agnostic, but that's their right under our Constitution. And so their right not to be is protected as much as our right to be, right? Okay, so I'm just going to get real comfortable here.
You should.
My shoes hurt my foot. Okay, so, so it's a framework of thinking. And so we're going to talk about Christian nationalism in our country, in the United States, and how Christians might respond to it. So we're going to come up with a definition of Christian nationalism and talk about some of the characteristics and the theological, excuse me, perspectives that may help safeguard our church and our communities. So first I'm going to talk about a little overview of Christian nationalism. So tell me what you think when you hear that, when you hear it on the news, when you read something about it. What do you think Christian nationalism is? Anybody?
Extreme.
Extreme? Okay. Somebody, I saw that hand. I was about to fall. Okay, it's like an auction, don't it? Okay, anybody else? What do you think when you hear it, when somebody talks about it?
Militaristic.
Militaristic, okay. All right, anybody else? What do you hear? You probably heard it mentioned around the January 6th incident at our Capitol. So,
Frightening.
Frightening. Okay. I'm sorry? Bully, okay. Okay. Violent.
I'm going to use Lisa's word extreme and put nationalism with it. Extreme nationalism.
Okay. All right.
Segregation.
Okay. Segregations, making divisions between groups of people. Okay. All right. I think all of those things are part of it. Everything that was said a second ago are part of what Christian nationalism means. And we're going to watch, this is Amanda Tyler, who's executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee, and we're going to watch a little video clip, Gary, of her.
Online.org. Nearly 2 years ago, we recognized a need for some common language to understand and call attention to a troubling ideology that was on the rise and that threatens religious freedom for all. Christian nationalism is not new, but the frequency of violent acts inspired by Christian nationalism and a resurgence in attempts to legislate and govern from a position infused with Christian nationalism has been on a dramatic uptick in recent years. We believe that Christians bear a special responsibility to understand and to root out Christian nationalism, not just in its most obvious and extreme forms, but in the pervasive, deeply ingrained manifestations in our culture, our churches, and ourselves. And so, working with a number of other Christian leaders, we developed the Christians Against Christian Nationalism initiative, which can be found at christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. On that website, you will find a number of resources to understand Christian nationalism, from a one-pager called What is Christian Nationalism, to a 10-part podcast series that I hosted on the dangers of Christian nationalism. This open platform allows individual Christians from across the breadth of American Christianity to show their solidarity with principles of faith freedom.
Is that it? Gary? Is that the end? Okay.
Okay, so she says one thing that it's been around a long time. It hasn't seemed to always be as extreme or as violent. That seems to be on the uptick, the violence associated with it. But if you look at the very back of your folder there, you will find that there is a page that says Responding to Christian Nationalism, Statement of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. You don't need to read that right now, but you might want to read that. In that website she talks about is, on the next page, I think it is, gives you the address of that website, christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. Okay, so she claims two things about Christian nationalism. First, she says it's a troubling ideology. And second, she says that the threat of Christian nationalism is not something that is new. When do you remember first hearing that term, Christian nationalism? Anybody think about it? When did you first hear it? Anybody? Tonight. Okay. Thank you for sharing honestly about that. Yeah, Randall?
Sometime within the last 10 years.
Okay, last 10 years. We probably heard it, but we didn't call it that. We didn't have a name for it. When you've heard people say, America is a Christian nation, the United States is a Christian nation, that is a form of Christian nationalism, because it's saying you gotta be a Christian, you gotta be an American, you gotta be, if you're American and you're a good American, you gotta be a Christian. And we know that in our country there are many diverse groups of people. Okay, so she said those two things. So when you talk about an ideology, how do you think an ideology can distort how we view or practice our faith? So it's an ideology that believes you've got to be a Christian if you're going to be an American, to be a citizen and a good citizen, because we're a Christian nation. So when we heard people talk about that maybe a long time ago, we probably didn't know the extremes of it, the violence of it, and all of those things that we're seeing manifested today. So how do you think an ideology could distort how we view or practice our faith? Anybody? What's your idea?
Well, the Bible was used to support slavery.
Okay. The
So-
Bible was used to support slavery, yeah.
Yeah, you can take your Christian faith
Mm-hmm.
and justify
Mm-hmm.
whatever you want to.
That's true. We talked about that little book, Philemon, Sunday before last, and how that book was used by people who were trying to keep people in slavery. To say, well, Paul said he should go back to his master and do what he's supposed to do. And so that must mean that that's, and now we know that's not what Jesus said, right? About enslaving another person. Okay, let's watch the second video clip. This is Dr. Andrew Whitehead, who talks about the characteristics of Christian nationalism.
Thank you, Amanda. I really appreciate that introduction. And thank you to EJC and to those also on this panel and this webinar. I really look forward to the conversation and being able to talk through really important issues at a pivotal moment in our country's history. And so I'd also like to recognize my colleague and co-author Samuel Perry, who is at the University of Oklahoma. This effort was a collaborative effort from top to bottom. And so much of what we have in the book and what I'll share today is kind of a quick overview. It's due to being able to work with him. And so I'm grateful for him and his work. So a number of weeks ago, January 6th, we saw some really incredible images that in many ways were so shocking. And so we can move to the next slide. And while they were shocking to see the violent insurrection in the Capitol, in many ways they weren't necessarily surprising to those of us that have been following along or tracking with Christian nationalism and studying in the United States. As Amanda shared, Christian nationalism is not new, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. But what we saw there was a culmination of the past number of years, especially the Trump presidency, where we see groups praying for crosses and then storming the Capitol, or as you can see on the picture on the left, the Jesus 2020 sign taking place there. So in order to make sense of this riot, while Christian nationalism is not the only explanation, it is a key part of understanding what took place. And so we need to understand how to define Christian nationalism if we're going to confront it, whether it's in our congregations or our workplaces or even in our families. We need to know how prevalent it is and how influential it is in key social issues. So our book is the best way to begin to understand that. So I appreciate it, and I'm encouraging you all to take a look at that. But what I'd like to do today is give you some of the key portion of that book to answer some of these questions. So we can move to the next slide. So the big question is, what is Christian nationalism and how do we measure it? So we define Christian nationalism as a cultural framework. And this cultural framework idealizes and advocates for a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. And now the asterisk by Christianity is key. And as we explain in our work, this cultural framework is a collection of myths, symbols, traditions, narratives, value systems that all want to see this type of Christianity privileged in the public sphere. It also includes, though, this idea of Christianity, assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, patriarchy, authoritarianism, and military. So the Christian nationalism, to a certain population means people like us. And the people like us are generally white, native born, and culturally Christian. So it's a cultural package. Now, one thing that may be asked is, how is Christian nationalism different from civil religion? And this is a great question.
Okay, so he gave us a definition, a cultural framework that, I'm having trouble seeing at the back. A cultural framework that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. And as I said, people can believe in Christian nationalism and not be violent, not go out and try to hurt somebody else because of it. They can believe that, they may firmly believe that God ordained our country and that we are, our American culture is the way of life. So there are people that genuinely believe that. Then there are people that believe in a more pluralistic society, a more pluralistic way of approaching faith. So he says at the bottom of that, let me get down here with the definition. It is, I had it right here on my page if I paid attention. So the cultural framework that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. So then the question is cultural framework. What does that mean? And so then to further define it, Christian nationalism seeks to merge Christian and American identities, distorting both the Christian faith and America's constitutional democracy. Christian nationalism is a framework of thinking that demands Christianity be privileged by the state and implies that to be a good American, one must be Christian. So how could you envision a group of people fusing or merging their Christian and American identities? How could you see that happening? And maybe you've seen it happen in our country. Privileging Christianity, what does that mean? How does that play out in our government, in our country? Yes?
Prayers at football games.
Okay, we should be able to say a Christian prayer everywhere because we're a Christian nation. So we don't think about people that are there who are Buddhist or Muslim or whatever, Jewish. I've always felt sorry for my Jewish friends because they're in the minority so many times and they just have to sit and go with it. And they're good about doing that, but I know they probably get tired of it. But anyway, okay, that's a good one. Julia?
Public schools have Christmas pageants.
Public schools what?
Having Christian pageants.
Oh, having Christian, yeah,
Christmas.
like a Christmas pageant. Right, so celebrating holidays that are uniquely faith-based holidays, Christian holidays like Christmas. So you'll notice that some schools now call it like they have, what's the word they turn, you know, they,
Holiday.
like a holiday, yeah. So, yes, Vicki?
Well, I'm old enough to remember the day that they decided to take prayers out of school. And because I'm from, and you're absolutely right, we didn't put a name Christian nationalism on it. But I grew up with it, okay, all around me. Which is why my dad used to say, that's why I says, in God we trust on our coins, right there. Because here's a godly nation.
Right.
So it kind of went hand in hand with, the service and being in the military and, but yeah, the day that, I can't remember her name, but, when they took prayer out of schools, and I decided it wasn't good for the kids that aren't necessarily of that same socioeconomic background, that same cultural, upbringing. It leaves a lot of people out. And
Right.
so that's exclusionary, and that was, that's in the 50s. Yeah, Madeline. Yes, that's her name. And so she was like the devil in my house for a long time.
Yeah, I think she died and people were still telling stuff she was doing. And she, that she's out doing X, Y, and Z. Yeah, I think that it's just like the term took prayer out of the schools, because it's impossible to take prayer out of the schools, right? If you're a Christian and you believe in prayer, you can pray anytime, right?
Well, I think it also can help, it's on a smaller level that you wouldn't even think. At our HOA meeting last month, I had never been, I just thought I'd go, my roommate's been out of town, and we went and they had an opening prayer. And while I appreciated it, halfway through I was like, wow, because I'm like, the board it's funny, everything here, they all were white. I would imagine all Christian, but I kind of was like, our gated communities probably got a lot of different representations. So something like that isn't, I wouldn't say is nationalism. They probably weren't even thinking that, but in that context, that's how I think this can grow.
Right. Exactly.
For everything you look at is innocent, but that's where the roots can start.
Right, it's often done it's not done in a way to, like you say, it's often innocent and people don't think about what that means to someone who's sitting there. And I do want to tell you something just because I have some experience with it. What about the prayer in schools? So the year I worked at the Baptist Joint Committee, they did a friend of the court brief on that case that was brought, Mergens, the young girl, and they brought a case because they wanted to have a Bible study at school. And a lot of people don't realize the outcome of that case, and that is any group can have a Bible study at school as long as the school doesn't put it on. So if students want to gather and have a Bible study and they're Christians, or if they want to study and they're Jewish, or whatever, they can do that in the public schools. It cannot be sponsored or presented by the school. And so if you look up that case, it's Mergens v. I can't remember, but you'll read about that and about what happened and find out. A lot of people will try to tell you a different story, that can't happen and we can't have the Bible in school, and that's really not the case.
We have a group I think they meet a couple of times a week, that it's a Bible study type deal, but it's the kids do it.
And like they probably do that, gather around the pole thing. Yeah, the flagpole, you can do that. That's their right to gather and do that. So, but those are all good examples. Julia?
This happened in the 50s.
In the when?
50s.
My husband, his mother was a special ed teacher, and she was Jewish, and she would celebrate all the religions that, for Christmas and Hanukkah, and she made a point of including everybody that was in class.
Uh-huh.
in the religion. And to me, that's a wonderful idea.
Yeah, to be inclusive of everybody, yeah. Yeah. So, Shannon, can you come here just a second, please? Right, and to know that there are children from many different backgrounds. I've told you before, 1,000 lives back, I taught school, and I taught in the 5th grade, and so I taught in an open classroom, so there were five teachers.
You weren't the math teacher,
I wasn't
right?
the math teacher. Well, actually I was, so I hate to tell you. But anyway, there were 5 teachers, 5 classrooms, but it was totally open. And that was when that was the end thing in education. And in that about 150 students probably, there were about 30 kids per teacher, there was one Jewish boy. And back then, I didn't know that they had scheduled a practice, so we're going to go 5 more minutes and then we're going to dismiss. But anyway, this one Jewish child, and we were allowed, every morning we started school with, we read from the Bible. And a lot of times it was from the New Testament. And I just now think back, I've told this to some of you, and I think back on that child and I wonder how he felt to sit there day in and day out and hear something that was totally different than what his family practiced and believed. And I feel really, I think it's fine to have a moment of silence if you want to, and then people can do what they want, they can pray a prayer or they can do what, but not to read a sectarian document like our Bible, the New Testament, and then expect everybody to sit there and listen. So those are all great examples of what we're talking about, and that is merging the culture with religion. And I can remember back then when I taught, the school board meetings opened with prayer. And on the one hand we go, isn't that great? But then nowadays, it used to be in the 50s that there was a lot more homogeneity. Everybody was more the same than they are today. We didn't have as many people from other countries in different faiths as we do today. And so it's a very different situation. But anyway, so I'm gonna wrap up so Marcy can have some time to practice. But next week, hopefully we'll be able to we'll find out what we need, and we'll be able to hook up to not hook up, but connect the computer to the, I learned that the hard way, right? So, and I didn't learn it here, I learned it from my grandchildren. They say, Gigi, don't say that. So, anyway, so next week we hope we'll have the equipment that we need to use the fellowship hall. But here's what I'm going to invite you to do. I want you to think about this, and if it's like, well, I don't really agree with that, that's okay. But I just am inviting you to think about it, and let's talk about it together. And nobody's going to try to make you believe. I'm not going to try to make you believe like I believe. Nobody else has the right to do that either here in this room. So we're going to, I hope, have an open conversation and share. And if you want to look at that website, that the address is in the back of your folder, you might want to take a look at that. And anyway, so next week we will go further than we did this week, I promise. Let's say a prayer before we go. God, we thank you that you've given us minds to think with, hearts to feel with, hands to serve with. And we pray that you would help us to be open to listening and learning from each other, and to learning more about faith then maybe we know now. We pray that you'll be with us each week as we talk about this important topic. We give you thanks, oh God. Amen. Joel, I need to